Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean McMillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Okay, so this video is a digital preservation overview. Okay, so digital preservation is a very broad topic, and I should point out first of all that this video is quite a high level overview. I thoroughly recommend you undertake additional research and additional reading after at the end of this video. That's highly recommended. Essentially, I've broken this video into three areas. That's acquirement or ingesting materials, preservation practices, the things you do to try preserve them as long as possible, and access, how you can go about making materials accessible. It's worth pointing out that the OAIS model offers a very good general model, and on each slide where I introduce each of the three topics, at the very bottom note I've indicated the part of the OAIS model that correlates to that step in the process. So yeah, okay. Okay, so the first stage I'm going to talk about is acquirement. So when deciding on whether to acquire materials, many of the considerations I would say are similar to that of traditional archival accession work. It begins with a solid understanding of your own institution, needs, wants and abilities. It is crucial to note that you should have or be confident of senior management support, and this applies to materials that maybe already exist within the institution, such as your own records, and also materials external to the institution that you're acquiring. These decisions are not taken alone and very much include the input of others. Most institutions will have what's known as a collecting policy and will therefore target collections that suit them as an institution. So, I would always recommend some form of what I would call pre-appraisal. It would mean considering what you want to preserve, what sort of materials you feel are relevant to your institution, and using that as the very first step in making a decision on whether or not you acquire materials or whether you ingest them into a digital archive. I think a very key general thing to consider is your storage facilities. How much data can you support and back up? Are you putting these files on a cloud, for example, which is personally recommended? And if so, what right considerations may there be? And also, maybe try think of your metadata abilities. I would say that preserving massive volumes of digital material, unless you can give those individual items the proper metadata, it can become extremely difficult to navigate. So metadata is a massive consideration. I would recommend keeping metadata as much as possible during accession. So good record keeping about how you came to possess certain materials. This might mean a chain of custody about who had it before and the circumstances, about how it ended up in a digital archive. I would keep records of that. And I would say that good general management of digital materials depends on metadata. And I would personally recommend that you try follow some sort of schema, that you try use something such as, say, Dublin Core or Premise, which will be a lot more standardized and give you a lot more structure and precedent to follow. And I also recommend that you definitely consider this before you acquire materials, and also consider what technologies you have available. It is possible that a lot of digital preservation tasks can be automated, and I would personally recommend automation where possible. And if you're using a software such as Archivematica or Preservica, then this will help immensely. And it can also enhance the sheer volume of information and materials that you can handle and also ingest and acquire. And it's also worth considering if you're able to quarantine materials or virus scanning before integrating with their systems. That's more of a sort of workflow style recommendation, but generally what I would say is if you're bringing or acquiring any new materials into a digital archive, you would want to have some sort of plan for ensuring that they're safe from a sort of virus perspective before you integrate them with your broader systems. I would also say that you would need to consider what formats you can and cannot support and what you can make available, especially if you're a library or research centre, and it's definitely worth considering the legal status of what you may acquire, especially in terms of things like copyright. So for example, if you take in a lot of materials into a digital archive and you don't own the copyright for it, then you might find that you're unable to make it accessible, and that's something you need to think about. And I would also say it's worth considering at what point in an item's lifespan are you coming in at. This isn't necessarily a fatal decision. If you're acquiring very valuable materials, you know, that you've not been involved in at the early stages, that's not necessarily a red flag or something that should put you off acquiring it. But what I would say is that the earlier you're involved with a digital item, the better, as it means that you can implement and record vital metadata and control formats and versions, etc. So basically, the earlier you're able to act or intervene, the much better. Just lastly, the DPC, they have a fantastic decision tree, which is immensely helpful when considering whether you should acquire certain types of digital materials. And just to correlate this to the OAIS model, there's a section in the OAIS model which talks about a submission information package, and this is highly relevant to this section of the presentation. Okay, so a very quick case study. I was previously involved in a role where I created and accessioned a series of written interviews which were in a digital format. The collection in question suited my library's collecting policy, and it related heavily to one of our pre-existing collections. Before accepting this collection, I identified where we would store the items, which was a cloud storage facility and an external hard drive. I estimated how large the collection would be, and also I identified what metadata I could record, which I tailored to Dublin Core. Moreover, I also knew what formats I could manage, and this helped immensely, as I'd previously come across items in old formats which we couldn't access, and I knew from that experience what we could and couldn't do. I clarified the legal status of the items and ensured we were permitted to collect them and could also make them available. And lastly, one of the things that was really helpful here was being able to be involved in the very early stages, where I was able to control the formats being used to create these items and the number of versions created for each item. Okay, so when it comes to actually preserving digital materials, it's worth pointing out there are different levels and various approaches, ranging from literally doing nothing to migration, which I would say is quite common, to more sophisticated methods such as emulation. There are some considerations you always want to be aware of, such as fixity and validation, and this might include things like applying checksums to items to ensure they've not changed. And I would also say disaster planning and risk assessment is also quite important as well, as is audit trails and technology watches. Two major considerations are storage and metadata, which I touched on briefly before, is something you need to consider when acquiring materials. In terms of storage, I would recommend keeping materials in more than one recorded place, such as cloud storage and an external drive, and it should also be accessible but also secure, and that may include using passwords to ensure materials can't be accessed or damaged accidentally or maliciously. Personally, I would recommend setting some sort of time plan and setting targets. I don't think it's wise to plan for indefinite preservation, but instead to set targets which are reviewed over time and can change as the technologies and the landscape changes as well. One method that's often quite popular is enrichment, and this is essentially an approach where you start off quite basic and you implement more advanced measures as you go. So you maybe only record very basic metadata at first, but then you begin applying more complex metadata as the project evolves. Okay, and just to give a case study, so a few years ago, I worked on a small collection of audio-visual materials. My first step after scoping and auditing them was migrating them onto a newer format. I applied checksums to the created digital output and also planned for disasters such as not being able to access the technology needed to play them. So this included backing them up in another location and also another format for safety. I primarily stored them on an external dedicated drive, but also backed them up on a private server which could only be accessed by people, including myself and a few other members of staff that were allowed access. I applied the most basic metadata at first, but I enriched this as time went on. I eventually implemented premise metadata, which allows you to record information about events, actors, objects, and rights. I also monitored the technological landscape and kept an audit of who accessed the materials. I initially planned for 6 months and then expanded that to 1 and 2 years respectively as time went on. And generally this is quite accessible. So the last time I'd worked on this project, the materials fortunately were still accessible. Okay, access. So there are a number of ways that digital materials can be made accessible. This may include access via computers on site, while other places may make them available online via the use of a portal. Legal considerations here are quite vital, especially copyright and GDPR. Users will also, at the very least, I would say, need some kind of catalogue or way of knowing what you have and how to access the materials. You may also need to make additional metadata available with the materials. I would say you would also need to consider formats and technologies, and in most cases I would personally recommend creating an access copy for people to access, as I thoroughly do not recommend making master copies accessible. And depending on the access method you have, this may involve the use of certain conversion tools. If possible, I personally recommend using some form of platform or something that can allow you to make information available in a more structured and organized way. And I think this might be a lot more efficient than a request and fetch approach. So for example, the British Library, they have a portal where you can access digital records relating to the Qatar Digital Library project, which is a very interesting project, and it's online and the metadata is there, and it's a lot easier to do it that way than it is for someone to send a message to the British Library requesting access to a digital record that they then either have to go and visit in person or might in some way be sent out to them. Okay, so a quick access case study. So a few years ago, I worked on a project where I was making my employer's digital resources available to a selected clientele who needed it for a related project. So my first action here was to send them some kind of finding aid they could use to navigate and request our materials. Our workflows were still at a very basic stage, and essentially at this point it was an Excel sheet, one that included titles, a description and a reference code which users could use to request materials. That said, it was also very important to check the copyright and details of our materials so they were not made accessible by accident. And of course, I was very sure not to make anything available that included sensitive personal data. That would be a GDPR concern. It was also important to know. It's also important to know your user community, and in this instance, it was very important to know which formats that the users could access and what additional metadata they would need. Fortunately, we weren't forced to use any conversion tools. They were able to use the materials in the access formats that we used. But what we did do is we converted materials from master version to an access version, which they could then access. And we sent these materials using WeTransfer, although I personally feel a portal or something would have probably been better long term. Lastly, we kept information on what was requested and how long it took to access, etc. And this helped to make us better decisions long term. So yeah, so overall that covers the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'd be more than happy to hear any comments or thoughts below. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.